A successful pianist mocks a young pianist. When he sees her walking onto the stage, he falls to his knees. Hello and welcome to 80s Love Stories, where I, your favorite narrator, Christopher, bring you an exciting love story straight from the unforgettable 1980s. Get ready for a journey full of nostalgia and incredible twists. Today's story is truly remarkable, with an ending that's sure to touch your heart and leave you amazed. So, stay with me until the very last moment. I hope this experience is unforgettable for you, and may God bless you and your family. Now, let's get started. Part 1. The High Notes of Pride. New York City, 1984. The crystal chandeliers of Carnegie Hall cast their warm glow over the packed audience, their light dancing off the polished surface of the Steinway Grand Piano Center stage. Peter Morrison, acclaimed as one of America's finest classical pianists, sat in the front row, his perfectly tailored Armani suit a statement of success, as bold as the platinum records adorning his Manhattan penthouse. At 42, Peter had everything he'd ever wanted: fame, fortune, and the adoration of classical music lovers across the globe. His recordings of Chopin's nocturnes had earned him international acclaim, and his interpretations of Beethoven's sonatas were considered definitive by critics worldwide. Tonight, however, he wasn't performing. He was judging the Young Classical Musicians Competition, an annual event that could launch an aspiring pianist's career. Peter had been asked to be the head judge, a position he accepted with his usual air of superiority. "These young players," he whispered to Harold, a fellow judge, "they all think they're the next Vladimir Horowitz." He chuckled, adjusting his gold cufflinks. "But they lack the soul, the dedication. Music isn't learned in suburban living rooms between episodes of MTV." The competition had been underwhelming so far. 17 contestants had played, and Peter had dismissed each one with cutting remarks. His reputation for brutal honesty had preceded him, and several participants had left the stage in tears. "Next performer," announced the master of ceremonies, Julia Thompson, 18 years old, performing Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 in C minor. Peter's eyebrows rose slightly as a young woman in a simple blue dress walked onto the stage. Her outfit was clearly off the rack, probably from one of those department store sales. Her brown hair was tied back in a practical ponytail, and she wore no jewelry except for a small silver music note pendant. She approached the piano with quiet confidence, but Peter had already begun writing his critique. The way she adjusted the bench, her posture as she placed her hands over the keys, he'd seen it all before. Another small-town girl, with big dreams and mediocre talent. Julia took a deep breath and began to play. The first notes filled the hall, and Peter's pen stopped moving. Her touch was different. The opening bars of Rachmaninoff's concerto, usually played with heavy drama, flowed from her fingers with an unusual lightness. She wasn't trying to impress. She was telling a story. For a moment, Peter felt something he hadn't experienced in years: uncertainty, but he quickly suppressed it, focusing instead on finding flaws in her technique. Yes, there, her tempo was slightly off in the transition, and there, a minor slip in the left-hand arpeggios. When Julia finished, the audience erupted in applause. Peter noticed several people wiping tears from their eyes, but he remained stoic. When it was his turn to speak, he cleared his throat and leaned into the microphone. "Miss Thompson," he began, his voice carrying the weight of his reputation, "that was interesting." The hall fell silent. "Your interpretation shows a concerning lack of respect for Rachmaninoff's original vision. The tempo variations were arbitrary, and your emotional affectations distracted from the technical precision the piece demands." Julia stood there, her hands clasped in front of her, listening without reaction. "I would suggest," Peter continued, enjoying the power of his position, "that you spend less time trying to reinvent established masterpieces and more time mastering the basics. Perhaps starting with something simpler, like Clementi's sonatinas." A few nervous laughs rippled through the audience. Julia's cheeks flushed pink, but she held her head high. "Thank you for your feedback, Mr. Morrison," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the humiliation. As she walked off stage, Peter felt a familiar satisfaction. These young musicians needed to learn that talent alone wasn't enough. He had worked hard for his success, spending countless hours practicing in cold conservatory rooms, sacrificing everything for his art. Why should this generation expect an easier path? What Peter didn't notice was the way Julia's hands trembled as she gathered her sheet music backstage, or how she carefully folded the program containing her mother's encouraging note written in the margins. He didn't see her slip out the back door of Carnegie Hall into the cool September evening, or watch as she walked to the subway station, her dreams seemingly crushed under the weight of his words. He also didn't know that this encounter would mark the beginning of a story that would change both their lives forever. For now, he simply made his final notes, already forgetting Julia Thompson's name among the dozens he'd dismissed throughout his career. The competition continued, but something had shifted imperceptibly in the grand hall. Perhaps it was the way the other judges glanced uncomfortably at their notepads, or how the remaining contestants played with a nervous energy that hadn't been there before. Peter Morrison had maintained his reputation as the industry's harshest critic, but he couldn't have known that his words that evening would set in motion events that would force him to question everything he believed about music, success, and the price of pride. As the night drew to a close, he gathered his things, nodding curtly to his fellow judges. Outside, his chauffeur waited with the car running, ready to whisk him back to his luxurious penthouse. But for the first time in years, the familiar comfort of his success felt somehow hollow, like a perfect cadence played without soul. The city lights blurred past his window as the car wound through Manhattan streets, and somewhere in the back of his mind, a melody lingered, not the way Rachmaninoff had written it, but the way Julia Thompson had played it, with that inexplicable lightness that had, for just a moment, made him doubt. Part 2. The Minor Keys. Julia Thompson's small apartment in Brooklyn echoed with silence. The upright piano that dominated her tiny living room stood untouched, its worn wooden surface catching the early morning light, filtering through yellowed curtains. 3 weeks had passed since the competition at Carnegie Hall, and she hadn't played a single note. Her mother's voice crackled through the corded telephone pressed against her ear. "Sweetheart, you can't let one man's opinion stop you. You've been playing since you were 4 years old." "Mum, it wasn't just any opinion," Julia replied, twisting the coiled phone cord around her finger. "It was Peter Morrison. His words carry weight in the classical music world." She glanced at the newspaper clipping on her coffee table, a review of the competition that quoted Morrison's harsh criticism. "Then prove him wrong," her mother said firmly. "Remember what your father used to say before he passed away. Music isn't about being right or wrong, it's about being true." Julia's eyes drifted to the photograph on top of her piano, her father sitting at their old family piano, smiling as he watched a young Julia play. He had been her first teacher, nurturing her love for music until cancer took him when she was 12. The music note pendant around her neck, his last gift to her, felt suddenly heavy. "I have to go, Mom. My shift at the record store starts soon." After saying goodbye, Julia grabbed her denim jacket and headed out into the bustling Brooklyn streets. The autumn wind carried the scent of coffee from the corner diner where she sometimes treated herself to breakfast when tips were good. Working at Melody Records wasn't her dream job, but it kept her connected to music, even if it meant organizing Whitney Houston and Madonna albums instead of playing Rachmaninoff. The small bell above the door chimed as she entered, nodding to her manager, Mike, who was already sorting through new arrivals. "Hey, Jules," Mike called out, pushing his wire-rimmed glasses up his nose. "There's a new shipment of classical records that needs pricing, and guess whose album is in there?" He held up Peter Morrison's latest release, his face photographed in dramatic black and white against a piano backdrop. Julia felt her stomach tighten. "I'll work on the pop section instead," she said, turning away quickly. "Still not over that competition, huh?" Mike's voice softened. "You know, I was there that night, came to support you. What Morrison said, it wasn't right. Everyone in that audience felt it. Can we not talk about it?" Julia busied herself organizing cassette tapes, but Mike wasn't finished. "You should come to the jazz corner tonight. My friend's band is playing, and they're looking for a pianist. Something different might be good for you." Julia almost refused automatically, but something made her pause. Her father had loved jazz, always telling her that classical training was just the beginning of a musician's journey. Maybe, she said finally. What time? That evening, Julia found herself in a small, smoky club in Greenwich Village. The place was packed with people wearing leather jackets and bright colors, their energy completely different from the stuffy atmosphere of classical concert halls. The band was good, raw and real, playing with a freedom that made her fingers itch to join in. During their break, Mike introduced her to the band members. The saxophone player, Tommy, grinned when he heard about her classical background. Classical, jazz, rock, it's all just different languages telling the same human stories. Want to sit in for a number? Before she could overthink it, Julia found herself being led to the small upright piano in the corner. The keys were slightly sticky, the instrument badly in need of tuning. But when the band started playing Autumn Leaves, something clicked. Her classical training merged with the jazz rhythm, creating something entirely new. For the first time since the competition, she felt the music flowing through her without fear or judgment. The audience responded, their heads bobbing, some closing their eyes to let the music wash over them. When the song ended, the applause was genuine and warm. "That was incredible," Tommy exclaimed. "Listen, we have a regular gig here every Thursday. The spot's yours if you want it." Julia opened her mouth to decline. This wasn't her world, it wasn't her plan. But then she remembered Morrison's words about mastering the basics. Maybe it was time to break free from those constraints. "I'll think about it," she said, surprising herself. Walking home that night, Julia felt something she hadn't experienced since the competition: hope. The city seemed different somehow, its rhythm matching the new melodies forming in her head. The next morning, she finally sat down at her piano. Her fingers found the keys of Rachmaninoff's concerto, but this time she played it differently. The jazz from the previous night influenced her interpretation, adding subtle syncopations and harmonic variations that would have horrified traditional classical pianists. She was so absorbed in playing that she didn't notice Mike had been trying to reach her until she checked her messages later that day. When she finally called him back, his excitement was palpable through the phone. "Jules, you're not going to believe who just came into the store asking about you." "Who?" she asked, her heart skipping a beat. "Rebecca Morrison, Peter Morrison's daughter. She heard you play last night at the jazz corner. She wants you to teach her piano." Julia nearly dropped the phone. "What? That's impossible. Why would she—" "She said she's been taking lessons for years, but hasn't enjoyed it until she heard you play last night. She wants to learn your style." Mike paused. "Think about it, Jules. This could be your chance to show Morrison what real teaching looks like." Julia sat down heavily on her couch, her mind racing. Teaching Peter Morrison's daughter would be either the best decision of her life or career suicide. There was also the question of whether she could separate her feelings about Morrison from her potential student. "Did you give her my number?" Julia asked finally. "No, but she's coming back tomorrow. Said she'd wait to talk to you in person." That night, Julia barely slept. She paced her small apartment, playing out different scenarios in her head. By morning, she had made her decision. She would meet Rebecca Morrison, but not out of revenge or spite. She would meet her because somewhere in Brooklyn, there was a young person who wanted to learn music, and Julia remembered what that felt like. As she got ready for work, Julia caught her reflection in the mirror. The music note pendant gleamed at her throat, and for the first time in weeks, she smiled. Sometimes the most powerful responses to criticism weren't delivered through words or confrontations, but through the quiet persistence of staying true to oneself. What she didn't know was that her decision would set in motion events that would challenge not only her own perceptions, but would shake Peter Morrison's carefully constructed world to its core. Part 3. Unexpected Harmonies. Melody Records was unusually quiet that Thursday morning. Julia stood behind the counter, absently reorganizing a display of new releases, her hands shaking slightly as she straightened a row of Tears for Fears albums. Every time the bell above the door chimed, her heart jumped. At precisely 10:15 a.m., the bell rang again. This time, a young woman entered, wearing an expensive-looking cream sweater and designer jeans. Her dark hair was cut in a fashionable bob, and she carried herself with the kind of confidence that came from growing up in Manhattan's Upper East Side. But there was something else about her, a hint of rebellion in her eyes that reminded Julia of herself at that age. "Are you Julia Thompson?" the girl asked, approaching the counter. Julia nodded. "And you must be Rebecca Morrison." "Please, call me Becca." "Nobody calls me Rebecca except my father when he's disappointed in me." She smiled, and Julia was struck by how different her warmth was from Peter Morrison's icy demeanor. "I heard you play at the Jazz Corner. It was amazing. The way you mixed classical training with jazz, I've never heard anything like it." "Thank you," Julia replied, still cautious. "Your father might disagree with that assessment." Becca's expression darkened slightly. "Sire, my father disagrees with most things that don't fit his definition of perfection. That's partly why I'm here." She glanced around the store, then lowered her voice. "I've been taking lessons since I was 5. The best teachers, the most expensive pianos, endless hours of practice. But I've never felt the music the way I felt it when I heard you play." Julia studied the young woman before her. "Does your father know you're here?" "No," Becca admitted. "And I'd prefer to keep it that way, at least for now. I'm 18, I can make my own decisions about who teaches me." Mike, who had been pretending not to eavesdrop while restocking shelves nearby, shot Julia an encouraging look. "I don't know, Becca," Julia said slowly. "Teaching you without your father's knowledge could be complicated." "Please," Becca insisted, "just one lesson. If it doesn't work out, I'll never bother you again. But I think we both have something to prove." Those words hit home. Julia remembered her father's encouragement, his belief that music should be shared, not hoarded. Would turning Becca away be letting Peter Morrison win twice? "One lesson," Julia agreed finally. "Saturday morning at my apartment. But if this goes badly—" "It won't," Becca interrupted, beaming. She pulled out a small notebook and pen from her designer purse, writing down her phone number. "Here's how you can reach me. And Julia, thank you." After Becca left, Mike wandered over. "Well, that was interesting." "Interesting is one word for it," Julia replied, still staring at the phone number. "What am I getting myself into, Mike?" "Something amazing, probably. Or terrible, maybe both," he grinned. "Those are usually the best kinds of stories." Saturday arrived too quickly. Julia had spent hours cleaning her small apartment, suddenly self-conscious about its modest furnishings. She'd even splurged on having her upright piano tuned, though it still couldn't compare to the grand pianos Becca was used to. At precisely 9 a.m., there was a knock at her door. Becca stood there, dressed more casually than before in leggings and an oversized sweatshirt, carrying a bag full of sheet music. "I hope you don't mind," she said, pulling out various pieces. "I brought some of my favorites, though I've never really enjoyed playing them the way I'm supposed to." Julia gestured to the piano. "Show me what you mean." Becca sat down and began playing Mozart's sonata in C major. Her technique was flawless, every note perfectly placed, but Julia understood immediately what was missing. There was no joy in the music, no personality, just precise, mechanical reproduction. "Stop," Julia said softly. Becca's hands froze over the keys. "Tell me, when you play this piece, what do you feel?" "Feel?" Becca looked confused. "I'm supposed to feel something." "Music isn't just notes on a page," Julia explained, sitting beside her on the bench. "It's a conversation. Here, let me show you." Julia began playing the same piece but differently. She added subtle variations in tempo, letting certain phrases breathe, highlighting the playful dialogue between the left and right hands. "Mozart wrote this when he was young and in love. Can you hear the joy in it, the teasing, the laughter?" Becca's eyes widened. "I've never thought about it that way. Father always says interpretation is just an excuse for imperfection." "Your father—" Julia stopped herself, choosing her words carefully. "Joyce, there are many ways to approach music. Technical perfection is one path, but it's not the only path." For the next 2 hours, they worked together. Julia showed Becca how to find the emotional core of each piece, how to let her personality shine through the notes. By the end of the lesson, Becca was playing with a freedom she'd never experienced before. "Same time next week?" Becca asked hopefully as she gathered her things. Julia hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Same time next week." Over the next few weeks, Becca's playing transformed. She began to understand that music wasn't just about hitting the right notes. It was about telling a story, expressing feelings, connecting with something deeper. Their Saturday morning sessions became a highlight for both of them. But their peaceful arrangement couldn't last forever. One Saturday morning, about 6 weeks into their lessons, Becca arrived looking troubled. "Your father's been asking questions," she said as soon as Julia opened the door. "He noticed I've been playing differently during my practice sessions at home. He says I'm developing concerning habits." Julia felt a knot form in her stomach. "Maybe we should stop the lessons." "No," Becca protested. "For the first time in my life, I actually love playing. I'm not giving that up." They proceeded with the lesson, but there was an underlying tension that hadn't been there before. As Becca played Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, her emotions spilled into the music, creating something raw and beautiful. Neither of them heard the apartment door open. Neither of them saw Peter Morrison standing in the doorway, his face a mask of cold fury, until the final notes faded away. "Rebecca," his voice cut through the room like ice. "What is the meaning of this?" Becca jumped up from the piano bench, her face paling. "Father, I can explain." "Can you?" His eyes fixed on Julia. "So this is how you respond to professional criticism, by corrupting my daughter's technique." Julia stood up, her heart pounding but her voice steady. "Your daughter came to me because she wanted to learn a different way of approaching music." "A different way?" Morrison's laugh was bitter. "How you mean the wrong way? Rebecca, get your things, we're leaving." "No." Becca's voice was quiet but firm. "I'm 18, Father. I can choose my own teacher." "Can you? And who's paying for your education at Juilliard? Who bought you your first Steinway? Who supported every aspect of your musical career?" The room fell silent. Becca's shoulders slumped slightly, but when she spoke again, her voice was steady. "I love you, Father, but you're wrong about this. Julia has shown me what music can really be." Peter Morrison's expression hardened. "We'll discuss this at home. Now, get your things." As Becca gathered her music with trembling hands, Morrison turned to Julia. "You haven't heard the last of this, Miss Thompson, I promise you that." After they left, Julia sat at her piano, her fingers hovering over the keys. She knew she should feel afraid. Peter Morrison had the power to destroy any hope she had of a classical music career, but instead she felt something else, determination. She began to play, letting her fingers tell the story of everything she was feeling. The music started soft, uncertain, but grew stronger, more defiant. It was Rachmaninoff's concerto again, but this time she played it without fear, without doubt, letting all her emotion pour into every note. What she didn't know was that Becca had forgotten her scarf and had run back to get it. She stood outside Julia's door, listening to the music, tears streaming down her face, and she made a decision that would change everything. Part 4. Dissonant Chords. The following week brought silence, not the peaceful kind that refreshes the soul, but the heavy kind that weighs on the heart. Julia's Saturday morning felt empty without Becca's presence. She sat at her piano, fingers resting on the keys, unable to play. The phone rang, startling her. It was Mike from the record store. "Jules, you need to see this." His voice was urgent. "There's an article in the Times about Morrison. He's organizing a special performance at Carnegie Hall next month. A showcase of young classical talents. And he's using your name." "What do you mean, using my name?" The article quotes him talking about unfortunate modern trends in classical music education. He mentions you specifically as an example of how not to teach, saying your influence nearly ruined his daughter's technique. He's using this showcase to demonstrate proper classical training. Julia's hands gripped the phone tighter. "He's trying to make an example of me." "There's more," Mike hesitated. "He's arranged for Becca to perform. She's going to play the same Rachmaninoff concerto you played at the competition." The irony wasn't lost on Julia. She thanked Mike and hung up, her mind racing. Walking to her small kitchen window, she watched the Brooklyn street below, where a group of kids were playing hopscotch to the beat of their boombox. Her father's words came back to her. Music isn't about being right or wrong, it's about being true. She touched the music note pendant at her throat, drawing strength from the memory. The next morning, Julia received an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Chen, her elderly neighbor who had often complained about her piano playing, knocked on her door. "No piano today?" the old woman asked, concern in her eyes. "Every Sunday morning for 2 years, I hear you play. Is nice. Makes me remember Shanghai when I was young." Julia smiled weakly. "Just taking a break, Mrs. Chen." "Ah, breaks are good, like rest notes in music. But too long break?" She shook her head. "Not good. Music must flow, like river. Even when path is blocked, river finds new way." As if to emphasize her point, Mrs. Chen pulled something from her shopping bag, a worn vinyl record. "From my youth. Chinese classical music played on piano. Different from Western-style bangs, but still beautiful. Sometimes different is good." Julia accepted the record, touched by the gesture. After Mrs. Chen left, she played it on her small turntable. The familiar sound of the piano merged with unfamiliar melodies, creating something that shouldn't have worked but somehow did. It reminded her of how Becca's playing had evolved during their lessons, finding her own voice within the classical framework. Later that afternoon, Julia was reorganizing her music sheets when she found Becca's scarf, forgotten in her hasty departure. Tucked inside its folds was a note she hadn't noticed before: "Don't give up on me. B." The words stirred something in Julia. She sat at her piano and began to play, not Rachmaninoff or Mozart, but something new, something that came from deep within. The melody carried all her frustration, her defiance, her hope. A knock at the door interrupted her playing. Her heart skipped a beat, thinking it might be Becca, but when she opened it, she found Tommy, the saxophone player from the jazz corner. "Mike told me what happened," he said, without preamble. "That Morrison piece in the Times, it's garbage, but maybe we can do something about it." "What do you mean?" Tommy grinned. "The jazz corner's been doing well. We're expanding our performance schedule, adding a Sunday afternoon session. How about you join us? Play whatever you want. Classical, jazz, fusion. Show people there's more than one way to make beautiful music." Julia hesitated. "I don't know, Tommy. Morrison's showcase is going to be at Carnegie Hall. The jazz corner is real," Tommy finished. "And that's what matters. Look, I heard you just now through the door. What you were playing, that's what music is supposed to be. Honest, raw, true. Not some stuffed shirt version of what someone else thinks it should be." As Julia considered his words, her phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize. When she answered, she heard Becca's voice and speaking quickly and quietly. "Julia, I'm calling from a friend's house. I wanted you to know I'm not playing that showcase, or at least, not the way he wants me to. Becca, be careful. Your father has been controlling my life and my music for too long. You showed me what it means to really play, to feel the music. I can't go back to being a mechanical piano robot." After hanging up, Julia turned to Tommy, who had been pretending not to listen. "When did you say those Sunday sessions were starting?" "Next week. You in?" Julia looked at Mrs. Chen's record, then at Becca's note, and finally at her father's photograph on the piano. "I'm in, but I have an idea about what to play." Over the next few weeks, Julia threw herself into preparation. During the day, she worked at Melody Records, but her evenings were spent at the jazz corner, working with Tommy and the band. She was creating something new, a piece that wove together classical themes with jazz rhythms, incorporating influences from Mrs. Chen's Chinese classical record, building to something that was uniquely her own. Word spread through the city's music community about the Sunday sessions at the jazz corner. Each week, more people came to listen. Music students, jazz enthusiasts, classical performers, they all squeezed into the small club, drawn by the rumors of something different, something special. What Julia didn't know was that among the crowd one Sunday afternoon was a music critic from the Village Voice, someone who had read Morrison's Times article and wanted to see for himself what all the fuss was about. She also didn't know that Becca had been secretly attending every performance, sitting in the back, taking notes, and making plans of her own. As the date of Morrison's showcase drew closer, Julia received another unexpected visit. This time it was Harold Etienne, the judge who had sat next to Morrison during the competition. "I've been coming to your Sunday sessions," he admitted, standing awkwardly in her apartment. "What you're doing, it's extraordinary, and I'm not the only one who thinks so." He handed her a newspaper, The Village Voice. The headline read, "Classical Revolution, Where Tradition Meets Truth." The article praised Julia's innovative approach, suggesting that perhaps it was time for the classical music world to re-examine its rigid definitions of proper technique. "Morrison's showcase is in 2 weeks," Harold said. "A lot of people will be watching, but maybe not for the reasons he thinks." Julia read the article again, her mind already racing with possibilities. She had been approaching this all wrong. This wasn't about proving Morrison wrong, it was about proving something else right. She sat at her piano, pulled out a fresh sheet of manuscript paper, and began to write. The music flowed from her heart through her fingers, carrying with it everything she had learned, everything she had felt, everything she believed about what music could be. What she was creating wasn't just a piece of music, it was a statement, a declaration of artistic independence. And somewhere across the city, in a mansion on the Upper East Side, Becca Morrison was making a statement of her own. Part 5. Rising Crescendo. The morning of Morrison's showcase dawned crisp and clear. Julia stood at her apartment window, watching the autumn leaves dance across the Brooklyn streets. Her phone had been ringing all morning. Mike, Tommy, even Mrs. Chen had called to wish her luck, but it was the call she'd received late last night that had changed everything. "Julia." Becca's voice had been barely above a whisper. "I need your help." Now, just hours before the showcase, Julia sat at her piano, remembering their conversation. Her fingers moved across the keys, practicing the piece she'd been working on for weeks, but her mind was on Becca's words. "I want to show him that there's more than one way to be true to the music." The plan was risky. If it worked, it could change everything. If it failed... Julia pushed the thought away and focused on the music. At Melody Records, Mike was helping her pack up her sheet music. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, carefully placing the papers in her bag. "Morrison's got a lot of influence in the classical music world." "I'm sure," Julia replied, touching her father's pendant. "Sometimes you have to risk everything to stand up for what you believe in." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the streets as Julia made her way to Carnegie Hall. The iconic building loomed before her, its architecture both magnificent and intimidating. Inside, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Morrison's showcase had attracted a full house. Critics, musicians, and music lovers filled the seats. Backstage, Julia could hear the murmur of the crowd. She found a quiet corner and sat down, closing her eyes to center herself. The sound of approaching footsteps made her look up. "Miss Thompson." It was Harold, the judge from the competition. "So I didn't expect to see you here." "I was invited," Julia said simply, thinking of Becca's late-night call. Harold nodded thoughtfully. "Morrison's in the green room with Rebecca. He's been... difficult. The pressure he's putting on her..." He trailed off, shaking his head. Julia checked her watch, almost time. She could hear the master of ceremonies beginning the introductions, Morrison's voice following with a speech about tradition and excellence in classical music. "Classical music is not a playground for experimentation," Morrison was saying. "It requires discipline, respect for the composer's intentions, and adherence to established techniques. Tonight, we will demonstrate the difference between proper classical training and modern deviations." The first few performers played beautifully, technically perfect but somehow mechanical. Julia watched from the wings, her heart aching for these young musicians who had been taught to suppress their own musical voices. Finally, it was Becca's turn. As she walked onto the stage in her elegant black dress, her posture was perfect, her expression composed. She sat at the grand piano, adjusted the bench, and placed her hands on the keys. The opening notes of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 filled the hall. At first, she played exactly as her father had taught her, precise, controlled, technically flawless. Julia could see Morrison in the front row, nodding approvingly. Then, subtly at first, something began to change. Becca started to incorporate elements she had learned during her sessions with Julia. The music began to breathe, to live, to tell a story. Her interpretation was neither purely classical nor revolutionary. It was something in between, something honest and true. From her position in the wings, Julia could see Morrison's expression changing from approval to confusion, to anger. He half rose from his seat, but Harold, sitting next to him, placed a restraining hand on his arm. As Becca's performance built to its climax, she added touches that were uniquely her own, subtle jazz influences, emotional swells that weren't in the original score, moments of improvisation that somehow made Rachmaninoff's music sound fresh and new. When she finished, there was a moment of complete silence. Then, starting from the back of the hall, applause began to build. Soon the entire audience was on their feet, all except Morrison, who sat rigid in his chair. Becca stood, bowed, and instead of leaving the stage, turned to the audience. "I have one more piece to play tonight," she announced, her voice clear and strong. "But I need help." She looked off stage, directly at Julia. "Miss Thompson, would you join me?" the audience murmured in surprise. Morrison's face went pale. Julia took a deep breath and walked onto the stage. This was the moment they had planned during that late-night phone call. As Julia sat down at the piano beside Becca, she could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes on them. But when she looked at Becca, she saw only determination and trust. They began to play the piece Julia had been working on for weeks, a duet that combined classical structure with modern interpretation, weaving together themes from Rachmaninoff with original compositions. It was a conversation between two pianists, two generations, two approaches to music. The piece built slowly, drawing the audience in. Traditional classical passages would flow into more experimental sections, each complementing the other. It was a demonstration not of right versus wrong, but of how different styles could come together to create something new and beautiful. As they played, Julia glanced at Morrison. His expression had changed. The anger was still there, but something else had crept in. Recognition, understanding. She couldn't be sure. The duet reached its final movement, and Julia could feel the emotion in the hall. This wasn't just about music anymore. It was about courage, about standing up for one's beliefs, about finding one's own voice. What happened next would be talked about in New York music circles for years to come. But as Julia and Becca played those final notes, neither of them was thinking about the consequences. They were thinking only of the music, of the truth they were sharing through their performance. As the last notes faded away, Julia looked at Becca and saw tears in her eyes. The audience erupted in applause, even louder than before. Critics were on their feet, music students were cheering, and Harold was smiling broadly. And Peter Morrison, he sat in his seat, his face unreadable, as his carefully orchestrated showcase transformed into something entirely unexpected. A demonstration not of the superiority of traditional methods, but of the power of musical evolution and personal truth. The applause continued as Julia and Becca stood and bowed together, but this wasn't the end of their story. It was, in many ways, just the beginning. Part 6. Echoes and Revelations. The backstage area of Carnegie Hall buzzed with excitement. Julia and Becca stood together, still breathless from their performance, as people crowded around them offering congratulations. Music students pressed forward, asking about their techniques, while critics scribbled furiously in their notebooks. Through the crowd, Julia caught glimpses of Peter Morrison, standing alone at the edge of the room. His face had lost its usual mask of certainty, replaced by something she'd never seen before, vulnerability. Miss Thompson. Harold appeared at her elbow, beaming. "That was extraordinary. Both of you." He turned to Becca. "Young lady, you've proven tonight that tradition and innovation can coexist beautifully." Becca smiled, but her eyes kept darting to her father's solitary figure. Julia squeezed her hand. "Go," she whispered. "Talk to him." As Becca made her way across the room, Tommy and Mike burst in through the stage door, grinning widely. "Jules," Mike exclaimed, "you should hear what people are saying in the lobby. They're calling it the performance of the year." Tommy nodded enthusiastically. "The jazz elements you wove in, pure genius, and the way you and Becca played off each other." Magic! Julia appreciated their excitement, but her attention was focused on the corner where Becca had reached her father. She couldn't hear their words, but she could see the tension in both their postures, the careful way they regarded each other. "Excuse me," a voice interrupted. Julia turned to find a distinguished-looking woman extending her hand. "I'm Margaret Wells, Dean of the Manhattan School of Music. I'd very much like to discuss a teaching position with you." Julia blinked in surprise. "Teaching at the Manhattan School of Music?" "Yes. What you and Miss Morrison demonstrated tonight, that's exactly the kind of innovative thinking we need. The ability to honor classical traditions while exploring new possibilities. That's the future of music education." Before Julia could respond, a commotion near the corner drew everyone's attention. Peter Morrison was walking towards her, Becca close behind. The room fell silent. Morrison stopped a few feet away from Julia. Up close, she could see the conflict in his eyes, the struggle between pride and understanding. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than she'd ever heard it. "Miss Thompson," he began, then paused, choosing his words carefully. "I've spent my entire career believing there was only one right way to approach classical music. One correct path to excellence." He glanced at Becca, then back to Julia. "Tonight, you and my daughter have shown me something different." Julia held her breath, aware of the dozens of eyes watching this exchange. "Your interpretation of Rachmaninoff at the competition," Morrison continued, "I dismissed it because it didn't fit my narrow definition of proper technique. But listening to you both tonight," he straightened his shoulders, "I was wrong." The silence in the room was absolute. Peter Morrison, the notorious perfectionist, the harshest critic in classical music, had just admitted he was wrong. "The piece you and Rebecca performed," and he said, "it retained all the complexity and beauty of classical music while adding something new, something honest." He extended his hand. "I owe you an apology." Julia looked at his offered hand, remembering all the pain his criticism had caused, but she also remembered her father's words about music being about truth. Slowly, she reached out and shook his hand. "Thank you," she said simply. Morrison wasn't finished. "Rebecca tells me she wants to continue studying with you." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Perhaps we could discuss a collaborative approach. There might be value in combining our different perspectives." Before Julia could respond, Mrs. Chen's voice cut through the crowd. The elderly woman had somehow made her way backstage and was now standing there in her Sunday best, clutching her Chinese classical music record. "See," she said triumphantly, "like river finding new path. Music always finds way." The tension in the room broke as people laughed. Even Morrison managed a small chuckle. Later that evening, after the crowds had dispersed and the excitement had died down, Julia found herself alone on the Carnegie Hall stage. The great auditorium was empty and dim, but she could still feel the echoes of what had happened there. She sat at the grand piano, running her fingers lightly over the keys, the same piano where hours ago she and Becca had made their statement about the true nature of music, the same piano where she had finally freed herself from the weight of Morrison's criticism. A sound made her look up. Becca stood in the wings, still in her performance dress but with her hair now loose around her shoulders. "Mind if I join you?" she asked, walking onto the stage. Julia moved over on the bench, making room. "How did it go with your father?" Becca sat down, touching the piano keys gently. "It's going to take time. He's still struggling with change, with letting go of control. But," she smiled, "he's trying. He actually asked me to play something, anything I wanted, just for him. No criticism, no corrections, just to listen." "And did you?" "I played that jazz arrangement of Mozart you taught me." He didn't say anything, but he closed his eyes and really listened. "That's a start, right?" Julia nodded, remembering how her own father used to listen to her play. "That's definitely a start." They sat together in comfortable silence, two pianists who had changed not only their own lives, but perhaps, in some small way, the future of classical music itself. "Julia," Becca said finally, "would you play something just for me?" Julia thought for a moment, then began to play. It wasn't Rachmaninoff or Mozart. It wasn't jazz or classical. It was something new, something that came straight from her heart. A melody about courage, about truth, about finding your own voice. As she played, she could feel Becca listening intently beside her, could sense the rightness of this moment. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, the teaching position to consider, the collaborative lessons with Morrison to plan, her own musical journey to continue. But for now, in the quiet of Carnegie Hall, there was just the music, and it was enough. Part 7. Final movement. 3 months after the showcase at Carnegie Hall, Julia stood in her new studio at the Manhattan School of Music. Winter sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating the 2 grand pianos that faced each other in the center of the room. On the wall hung a framed copy of the Village Voice article about that memorable night, alongside a photograph of her father at their old family piano. The door opened, and Becca entered, shaking snow from her coat. "Sorry I'm early," she said, pulling out some sheet music. "But I've been working on something new, a composition of my own." Julia smiled, remembering how much Becca had grown since their first lesson in her Brooklyn apartment. "Just let's hear it." As Becca played, Julia could hear echoes of their journey together. Classical foundations supporting contemporary expressions, technical precision dancing with emotional freedom. The piece was uniquely Becca's, reflecting both her classical training and her newfound artistic voice. "That's beautiful," Julia said when Becca finished. "Have you shown it to your father?" "Actually," Becca hesitated. "He helped me with some of the harmonic progressions. We've been working on it together." The words hung in the air, a testament to how much had changed. Peter Morrison, who once insisted on rigid adherence to classical traditions, was now helping his daughter compose original music that crossed stylistic boundaries. Their Tuesday afternoon sessions had become a highlight of Julia's week. Morrison would arrive precisely at 2, and for 2 hours, the 3 of them would explore music together. Morrison brought his deep knowledge of classical technique, while Julia contributed her understanding of emotional interpretation and contemporary styles. Becca flourished under their combined guidance. "Speaking of father," Becca said, organizing her music sheets, "he wanted me to remind you about the faculty concert next week. He says you can't back out of the duet you promised to play with him." Julia laughed. "I wouldn't dream of it." The planned duet with Morrison had been his idea, a public statement of their new approach to musical education. They would perform a piece that combined their different styles, showing students that there was room for both tradition and innovation in classical music. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. It was Tommy, carrying his saxophone case. Since the showcase, he had been teaching jazz workshops at the school, another change that would have been unthinkable just months ago. "Ready for our session?" he asked, grinning at both of them. Becca grabbed her coat. "That's my cue to leave. But first," she hugged Julia tightly. "Thank you for everything." After Becca left, Tommy began setting up his saxophone. "Hard to believe how much has changed since that night at the Jazz Corner," he remarked. Julia sat at one of the grand pianos, running her fingers over the keys. "Sometimes I still can't believe it myself." Their jazz workshops had become increasingly popular, attracting both classical students eager to explore new styles and jazz musicians interested in classical techniques. The rigid boundaries between musical genres were beginning to blur, creating something new and exciting. Later that evening, Julia returned to her Brooklyn apartment. She had kept it despite her new position at the school, unable to part with the place where so much had begun. Mrs. Chen still lived next door, and they often shared tea while listening to her collection of Chinese classical records. As she entered, Julia noticed a package leaning against her door. Inside was a vintage vinyl record of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, with a note from Morrison. "Found this original pressing from 1958. Thought you might appreciate it. Looking forward to our duet. PM." Julia placed the record on her turntable and sat at her upright piano, the same one where she had taught Becca those first crucial lessons. As Rachmaninoff's music filled the room, she began to play along, adding her own interpretations while respecting the original composition. The phone rang. It was Mike from Melody Records. "Just checking you're still coming to our Sunday session," he said. The regulars have been asking about you. Wouldn't miss it, Julia replied. Despite her new position and busy schedule, she had maintained her connection to the jazz corner. Those Sunday afternoons, playing with Tommy and the band, reminded her that music was about joy and connection, not just technique and tradition. After hanging up, Julia walked to her window. The Brooklyn street below was quiet, dusted with fresh snow. She touched her father's pendant, thinking about how proud he would be of everything that had happened. A new melody began forming in her mind, something that spoke of journeys and growth, of barriers broken and bridges built. She sat down at her piano and began to play, letting the music tell its own story. The piece started with a classical foundation, then gradually incorporated elements of jazz, hints of Chinese classical music, and finally something entirely new. It was a celebration of everything she had learned, everything she had become. As she played, Julia thought about the upcoming faculty concert. She and Morrison would perform together, showing their students that different approaches to music could not only coexist but enhance each other. Becca would be in the audience, probably with Mrs. Chen sitting next to her, both of them beaming with pride. The music flowing from her fingers spoke of possibility, the possibility of change, of growth, of finding beauty in unexpected places. It spoke of a young woman who had dared to challenge tradition, a father who had learned to listen with new ears, and a mentor who had found the courage to question his own beliefs. But most of all, it spoke of truth, the truth that her father had tried to teach her all those years ago. Music wasn't about being right or wrong. It was about being honest, being brave, and being true to yourself. The last notes faded away just as the first stars appeared in the winter sky. Julia sat quietly for a moment, feeling the rightness of where her journey had led her. She had found her voice, helped others find theirs, and in doing so had helped change the way people thought about classical music. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new students, new opportunities to bridge the gap between tradition and innovation. But for now, she was content to sit at her piano, surrounded by the echoes of everything that had brought her to this moment. After all, every great piece of music needs both structure and soul, tradition and innovation, discipline and freedom, just like life itself. And somewhere, in the delicate balance between these seemingly opposing forces, that's where the real music happens. That's where the magic lives. That's where the heart finds its true voice. Julia smiled and began to play again, her music floating out into the quiet Brooklyn night, carrying with it the promise of all the beautiful possibilities yet to come. Thank you for watching today's story. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to give it a big thumbs up, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel to relive the magic of the 80s every day with our heartfelt stories. May God bless you and your family, and don't forget to click on the video popping up on the screen right now. It's another totally rad story you won't want to miss. See you in the next video, and stay awesome.